Why don't we start with the easiest question, which is,
let's do it.
What's your name and what do you do?
Oh my gosh, that's the easy one. I'm Sam Bukowski and I lead commerce globally at GroupM's.
So we're talking about retail media. It's 2025, if you could believe it.
Yeah.
What should brands know about the trends you're seeing in retail media heading into 2025?
Yeah, there's so much going on. It's going to be a really interesting year. I think a really pivotal year. I mean, we've been talking about retail media for a decade at this point. I think the conversation's finally shifting. There's a couple things that we're seeing. The first that's kind of defining 25 for me is this kind of paradoxical trend of continued fragmentation, but at the same time, consolidation. And what I mean by that is, you know this better than anybody, but a new network seems to pop up still every day.
Every day.
All the retailers are realizing the value. But at the same time, how those dollars are being invested is starting to consolidate and kind of polarize, is what we say. So you think about Amazon, who has nearly 80% of retail media dollars in the US. Think about what that looks like on a pie chart, right? You have Walmart that falls behind them, I think just shy of 7%. And then you have this kind of 15, 16% of the tail. And so what we're seeing is this greater polarization, of these head networks, the torso networks, and the tail networks. And that's almost becoming a mechanism for some of our brands in terms of how they're thinking about their investment discipline. Like, how do we treat those categorizations of RMNs differently in the way that we engage with them and the percentage that we invest with them? And I think that we're going to see kind of the gap widening still between those networks at the top, the Amazons, the Alibabas, the JDs that are truly full funnel advertising at scale for everyone, a really crowded torso, right? And you have Walmart's kind of trying to make their way from torso into head, and then this really kind of unwieldy tail of networks. And so I think that polarization in certain ways will be helpful for brands to kind of organize themselves around how they want to treat those partners. But I don't think we're going to see too much slowdown in how those networks are still popping up. So that's one. The other thing, and we've talked about this a little bit, is how much of an intersection there's going to be between social and retail media.
Yeah.
Because if we
like
think
TikTok
about
made me buy it.
100%, but almost the evolved conversation of that. So we lived through, people search on Google, and then all of a sudden it was over 50% of product searches begin on Amazon. And now so many of those signals about what people want, what they're interested in, what they want to buy are starting in social. They're happening on TikTok. And so I think now when we're talking to brands about retail media in 2025 and how they invest intelligently, how they think about the creative they're putting out right into offsite, how do we tie social signals and what we're seeing in those environments closer to what we're doing with retail media? And that's going to require much more integrated, which is kind of if we could put one word on a t-shirt for us, at least at GroupM, it's always integrated commerce, integrated planning, integrated thinking. But it's going to kind of be a forcing function of that integration to bring social and retail media closer together. I'll give you one more and then we can keep going forever if you want. The other thing with retail media is it's always been, for the endemic clients, inextricable from their sales and their trade relationship, right? And there hasn't been really one kind of silver bullet function in any organization that spoke those languages equally well. And there's been somewhat of a divide just from legacy ways of working and organizational structures, I think, up between those two functions for a long time. Very much understandable. But in 2025, and we saw this at the end of 2024, and brands really stepping up and saying, we have to figure this out. We have to think about our retail relationships holistically. The way that retail media and our investment there is impacting our sales relationships, the way that they're managing their P&Ls in terms of balancing what's a trade investment versus what's a media investment. It feels like we've really gotten to that point with brands where they're willing to kind of challenge those legacy ways of working, bring a more cross-functional team to the table to have that conversation, because they don't have the luxury, I don't think, at this point of not doing that. A lot of them are under a tremendous amount of pressure, right? And, growth, true unit growth has been hard to come by. A lot of it has been on price and inflation. And so I think this will be a year where we start to see that wall break down. So not 100% a retail media trend, but still one that I think you can't really separate from retail media at this point. So I think we'll see that show up in the way brands are investing.
So going back to what you were saying about the tail, retail media network, does that mean that people just don't invest in the tail, or they're just...
Sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think that's another thing, right? There's been a lot of build it and they will come mentality from the retailers up to this point. And there's a lot of choice out there now. And I think brands are starting to say, we don't have to invest with everyone. And they shouldn't invest with everyone. And that doesn't mean that there isn't an importance on the sales side of that relationship, or that there shouldn't be an investment in driving demand to that retailer. But, you know, it's not infinite dollars. Every time that they slice that investment with another slice, it gets more complicated. And so one of the things that we've talked about a lot moving into this year is this concept of discipline, investment discipline. So it's not a blanket no, right? Or a blanket yes, but it's having those discipline guardrails around, okay, this is a tail network. What criteria has to be met if we're going to entertain a conversation around investment? And if it's not met, then you don't entertain it. But at least you can give the retailers then some really tangible reasoning as to why. And it's not just you shutting down the conversation because it's another investment to make, right? It has some really credible methodology behind it.
All right, integrated and discipline. So far, those are the buzzwords.
Those are my two favorites.
All right, so let's talk about innovations this year.
Yeah.
What innovations do you think are going to move the needle the furthest for brands investing in retail media?
Well, that's a good one. It feels almost like a cop-out to talk about AI, but you have to.
Most do, yeah.
I think Gen AI and the way that it is finding its way into more mainstream now is so powerful. And it's impacting every single part of the journey for consumers, but also for advertisers. On the creative side, I think it will be a huge unlock for brands who have really struggled to create and then version and then optimize all of the different creative assets that you need now across the retail media landscape, especially when there is very little consistency in terms of specs and requirements. And so I think what AI is going to be able to do for content to make it easier to get a greater scale of media out the door is going to be huge. And it's one of those things that maybe wouldn't have excited people a year or so ago, but I think is now one of the more exciting things. One of the other kind of innovation trends overall, I think, is stores. We heard a lot, I think, in 24, and a lot of people's predictions around what does the store look like and the digitization of store. Again, not new. We've been talking about that for a few years now, but it does feel like now we've hit the point where the technology is there, the measurement is starting to get there. And so I think the way we're going to be able to tie what's happening in a store environment to what we're doing in an online retail media environment, and pulling those audiences through on a much more sophisticated journey is something that brands have wanted for a long time, just hasn't been very easy. And so I think 25 will be the year we see that really take off.
With Gen AI creative, something I've been kind of wondering is, does this mean with the trend of personalization? So like as you read about, when you log into Walmart.com or Amazon.com, it's going to be very highly personalized to you and all that kind of stuff. So is it that brands are going to have 1,000 pieces of creative that have different messaging and different pictures based on this ability to be able to hyper target in advertising or being very personalized? Like, are brands going to have that many creatives? Or do you think, like, it just feels like that's kind of the direction of travel, where it's like, hey, one is just getting the creative. So like that's step one. Then, you know, like now you can have more ad creatives, ad types. And then you can cut it up across all the different retail media networks, and so you can advertise. But are you going to now have to have many different versions because you can have all this hyper targeting?
It's a good question, and in the way that you're framing it, you can hear like that sounds kind of scary for brands to think about. Just it's hard enough to generate what they need today, and then to think about more and all of the different possibilities. It can probably seem paralyzing. My perspective is what AI should do is make that not a paralyzing task. So really the answer is yes, in a lot of ways, but not via the same mechanisms that we used to.
Yeah.
So the burden of that creation should be relatively low moving forward. How it gets dynamically updated, right? We're not creating thousands of static versions and then manually selecting the right one to go out and then testing it and then pulling it back. You know what I mean? It's going to be a much more fluid process, and AI is going to have a role to play, I think, at nearly every single part of that journey. So I guess yes, but I don't think it'll be as scary, time-consuming, or expensive as we would typically think it would be prior to what, you know, AI has enabled us to do now.
Yeah.
So hopefully, I don't know, what do you think?
That's what I think the direction of travel is. I think that's the exciting part for brands is not the game, but it's like, if I can have a hyper personalized targeted ad that I'm showing a new mom versus, you know, maybe a teenage kid, and it has a different person in the ad and different messaging, and just, you know, like then it's going to have way better conversion and click-through rates. And so this ability to have that same product that you're selling, but be able to change it and target it to have, and we've seen better conversion when you add a Christmas tree to an ad, it's Christmas time, you know, like just this ability to have this very hyper-targeted, but that requires kind of that new creative that you can create. Like that to me is exciting.
Yeah.
And it's also like, and then using Gen AI to be like, okay, put a new mom in the picture. Okay. But you know, the prompt engineering that you need so that you can just quickly change it and put it out there is kind of the fun. And like, I'd like to see that. Like, I'd like to see that test and learn. And that'd be one of my questions is, you know, if you could set one resolution for brands in 2025 regarding retail media, what would it be?
Yeah.
That would be my, you know, kind of goal would be, hey, test using all this Gen Creative to see how good your conversion can get. Can you have 100 different audiences that are unique and they each have a different ad? I mean, is that crazy? But like, and see what works. Maybe you don't need 100, maybe you need 10.
Yeah. I love that. One of the things I find really powerful about how retail media is converging with other digital media and traditional media is how kind of one side is learning from the other. So if you think about DCO, sans retail media, and all of the intelligence behind DCO and digital media in general, we've been doing that, right? In the way that we use geosignals and weather signals and audience signals to do dynamic creative optimization in digital already. And now it's like, okay, well, how do we apply all of that intelligence and sophistication in a way that we actually know how to do to retail? The inverse of that is retail media came along with these signals, these high fidelity signals that were not modeled, right? But they were consented. And then the rest of the media world went, whoa, like that's so much rigorous information. And the measurement is almost too clear that we can unpack it in so many ways. I think the rest of digital learned from retail in that way. And so the more those things come together, I think the more we can kind of swap, you know, the best of what works for all of media. And that's kind of how integration helps us all. In terms of a resolution, I love the way that's framed, by the way. That's cute. I kind of gave it away a little bit early, but I'm really big on this concept of discipline. And the reason I think it's so important is because you can't innovate without it. And what I'm seeing now is, so the resolution for brands, and this is a little bit, you know, philosophical or maybe a little bit fluffy, but for me, is embracing a culture of innovation through discipline. And that's how I want to think about retail media, because we don't want to squash innovation. We don't want to stop testing. AI is the explosiveness of what, you know, we can do now is wild. And we want to be able to test and we want to be able to learn and try new things, not be afraid of failing, right? Not be afraid of not being perfect the first time, which is already hard, especially for these CPGs and FMCGs who are, you know, it's tough right now, right? And these kinds of economic realities don't necessarily breed cultures of innovation, right? Can get a little bit more conservative. But this is not the time to stop testing and to stop trying new things and to stop leading. However, if you do that without discipline, it's chaos, right? And so that discipline around how do we as an organization want to treat this? How are we prioritizing it across the org? It's not just commerce or retail media people's jobs. It's everyone's role to understand this and how it's driving the business forward. Once we understand what it means to us and what our minimum requirements are for those investments in a tail network, for how we're going to manage a trade and a media relationship side by side, you have to have those principles really, really clearly laid out within your organization. And then once you have that, then that's where the innovation comes in. Then you have the freedom to do that. You have the freedom to test all of this Gen AI and creative. And I think that's where it gets interesting. So those two things kind of living together in 25 is the kind of culture and philosophy that we want to see brands take forward.
I like that. All right. So your favorite question.
Oh boy.
Measurement.
Yes.
Can you share a unique metric that you prioritize when evaluating the performance and why you find it insightful compared to more traditional metrics?
Yeah. So most of the jokes, because I don't totally love this question. I think one of the great things about retail media is also one of the things that makes it tough is there are so many metrics and there isn't a ton of consistency across networks, right, in those metrics. And then even when they new to brand is a good example, right? Even when it does exist in two places, the way it measured can be different. And I do think that what we would focus on will be different every time. And so I don't necessarily think that there's one. For me, and I'm going to, back out and kind of challenge the question, is you have your kind of micro KPIs that are going to be based on that individual, campaign or that subsect of what you're trying to do. At a macro level, though, and this is how we really talk to the leaders of these organizations investing in retail media, is this should be share driving media. If it's not, something is not working, right? And it's got to work with all the rest of your investments and your national and your brand media and all of that. But being able to see and kind of trend out how this investment is contributing to your share growth, that's the North Star for us.
Okay.
Always. So it's market share. It's got to be market share. And it's got to be a sustainable and a profitable way to growth. But it's always going to be share for me.
Awesome.
Thank you.
What are you most excited about for 2025?
What am I most excited about? I am excited to see retail media becoming a core part of just modern marketing.
Yeah.
And that's the way that I think it's going. And I think for those that have worked in it for some time now, we've seen that that's kind of the direction things are going, but we weren't sure how long it would really take. We talked about it at Cannes last year as well, in terms of, it looks a little different here this year. We're starting to see this kind of presence from retailers, and what does next year look like? I think this is the year where we see it really as an integrated part of that modern marketing kind of approach. I don't think that should be scary to those working in retail media. I think that should be exciting, that everyone is more leaned in and more focused on how it can contribute to business growth.
All right. Thanks so much for your great insight.
Thanks so much.